Today's video is sponsored by Trade Coffee. It's time to reassess your coffee situation. Most coffee you get at the store is stale, dull, and questionably sourced. But it's easy to get stuck in a rut and just drink what you always have. Instead of standing in front of all those options at the grocery store, let Trade Coffee help you find something new to love. They ship to you free, whole or ground, as often as you'd like. What you're going to want to do is take the coffee quiz to get started. Based on what you tell them about your coffee preferences, they make suggestions for coffee that they think you'll like. I took the quiz and they recommended this one, Huck, out of Denver, Colorado, and it's great. And Trade guarantees that you'll like your first bag or they'll replace it for free. And right now, Trade is offering a total of $20 off your first 3 bags when you go to drinktrade.com/Mr. Terry or click the link down in the description below. That's more than 16 cups of coffee for free. Again, to get started, take their quiz at drinktrade.com/Mr. Terry and start your journey to the perfect cup. That's drinktrade.com/Mr. Terry to get $20 off your first 3 bags. All right, let's continue with the video. Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another video. All right, over the past month or so, I've been covering the Russia-Ukraine situation. And what I've been doing is trying to add historical context as a history teacher to help you understand a little bit better about what's going on. And one of the videos that I covered that got a good response to was Johnny Harris's video on Vladimir Putin and what his plans are. And he posted another video, and this one is titled, Putin Will Lose, Here's Why. So that's assuming already right away that Vladimir Putin and the Russians will fail in whatever their goals are. And I'm interested to see what he's going to use as evidence of that. And what I'm going to do is check this out and I'll give you my thoughts. And what I'm going to do is respond to the video here and give you my thoughts and add some more context if I can. And if you're interested to see in what I have to say more about the Russia-Ukraine situation, definitely check out the last few videos that I have done, and you will see a lot more coverage of this. And if you want to see me cover this more, let me know down in the comment section. All right, if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't. Love to have you around our community. And be sure to check out the original video link down below. All right, with that, let's get started. This video may be upsetting to some viewers. All right, same warning for me too. Just so you know, at the time this video come out, the invasion has already been happening for about a week, a little over a week, so there'll be some images, I'm sure, of what's going on.
Why are you doing this? Why are you fighting this needless war? This war of conquest that will topple so many lives. He sent his forces, his missiles, in the middle of the night. These are the troops, hundreds of thousands of them, that had been camped out on the border for months. Troops that Putin had insisted were there for a routine military exercise.
That's right. The invasion did not come out of nowhere, if you didn't know. There had been mobilization along the borders of Ukraine and Russia, and also Belarus, which is a Russian ally, as well for a long time. And that's where this got started weeks ago, even months ago, if you hadn't heard. And it was causing some alarm. But people, for the most part, again, if you look at news outlets, it seemed for the most part, nobody truly believed a full-scale invasion was going to happen, that this was going to be a just more of an intimidation or something. So it surprised a lot of analysts around the world when the invasion actually started.
And that the US and UK intel swore were actually preparing to invade.
Yeah.
Many around the world, including in Ukraine, thought that this was just the West being dramatic, stoking the tensions. But
that's what's interesting is, like he was saying, like the Americans, British were saying this was inevitable, but it didn't seem like in Ukraine itself, you had nearly the type of publicizing of it. And that could be wrong there. If you have some other sources that, especially more mainstream Ukrainian sources that were saying, hey, war could happen, people need to get ready, let me know. But as far as I'm aware, it didn't seem to be that aggressive sounding as what you heard in the days leading up from like the Americans, for example.
Intel was exactly right. Most of those troops crossed the border last week and are now inside the country.
Right.
Russian military vehicles, including tanks, entering Ukraine.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
The country's being attacked from all directions.
Our Hours after this invasion started in the middle of the night on Thursday morning, Ukraine's President Zelensky appeared on TV, not just to talk to his people.
Now by now, and since the first video that I posted, the first Johnny Harris response video I did, this guy has just become infamous. I mean, people, talk about him so much, and they're saying he's this, brave leader and is helping, keep the Russian people motivated and stuff. So right from the time you saw my first video to now, you have seen this guy become infamous, the president of Ukraine.
But to speak directly to Russians themselves.
Я обращаюсь к российским гражданам как гражданин Украины.
We share a border of over 2,000 kilometers. And along this border, your troops are stationed, almost 200,000 soldiers. Your leaders just approved them to make a step towards us, into the territory of another country.
As he's showing these addresses, he has been very media accessible during this first couple weeks of the invasion. It's actually been really interesting to see that, because he's had to move, a lot for safety reasons across the area, but he has been very active in the media and doing interviews, and people are going in and he's talking to them and he's making videos while in the midst of this. So it's been very interesting to see how you can see he very much is trying to get the world community on Ukraine's side and to gain support, because the Ukrainians feel often alone in this, as they're not a NATO nation, and up until the last few days they were not an EU nation either. And that's, if you want to know more context about that, definitely check out the last couple videos I responded to, the real life lore video as well as the other Johnny Harris video, and you'll see more context about why Ukraine wasn't part of NATO, because that's really important to understand.
This step is likely the beginning of a massive war.
Let me know what you think about Zelensky's response right now down in the comments too.
Russia again warned its nuclear
Love to hear what you think about him.
Were on high alert.
Several cities were hit in residential areas, resulting in dozens of civilian deaths.
This is a war unlike any war the world has ever
Johnny.
seen. It looks like a war from 1830, but it's happening in 2022.
Yeah, they're calling it the TikTok war. Have you heard this? That so many videos, short form videos by civilians in Ukraine, across Europe, of people putting this out, and just the media, or the coverage, on the ground coverage, is just incredible. But again, it's also makes this very difficult, as we know, as with this much access to people producing content, misinformation can be incredible, because there's very, very few filters out there. So of course, it's really important to understand that everything you see coming out of the war, on whatever side you may support of this or whatever, that you take everything with a grain of salt. I mean, often in these cases with wars, you don't truly know the story until a long time after the war is over.
Putin's army is much stronger than Ukraine's, at least in terms of numbers. If he really wants to, he probably is going to be able to take over the country's major population centers and oust the Ukrainian government. The US and NATO can't send troops for fear of starting a clash between two nuclear nations, something we simply do not do. It's a red line that no one crosses.
Question for you, answer in the comments. If Russia was not a nuclear power, do you think the UN would have, or UN nations would have come into here and put troops on the ground? Even though, again, it is not a, did I say UN? Sorry, I meant NATO. Do you think NATO forces would put troops on the ground here if Russia was not a nuclear power? What role do you think nukes are playing in the decision making about how nations are supporting Ukraine in this?
I want to tell you exactly why Vladimir Putin and his army are here. The story behind this invasion is the story of this one man's worldview, but it's also a story of a bet that he took, a bet that Ukrainians would give up, lay down their arms, and see the world the way he does. But if there's anything...
Do you think that's the case? I mean, do we have sources from Putin that he thinks that the Ukrainians are either, one, just going to lay down arms and beg for the surrender, push the government to surrender, or something like that? Does he believe, and maybe, he tried to appeal to this, something that Putin did, which was try to tell Ukrainians to support, like the Russians, that the regime that you're under is the unfair one, that you should, join up. And of course, that hasn't happened that much. But yeah.
I have learned in the past week, it's that even if Putin conquers a big portion of this country, something he has the military hardware to do, even if he does that, he still won't win this war. In fact, I'm here to argue
what is winning?
He's already lost.
There are big explosions.
What is winning? That is an interesting question that I don't think people always ask. What does winning mean?
People here are going to be waking up to a very different country than the one they went to sleep in.
2.5 million refugees, I think, right now. Today, by the way, when I'm filming this, it is Sunday, March 13th. And I've heard there's over 2.5 million refugees.
Russian strikes from all across the country.
Putin will lose, okay? Why will he lose?
Vladimir Putin has already lost this war. And to understand what I'm talking about, you have to look at two things. Number one, what Putin said right before the invasion. And number two, what actually happened once he invaded.
He said a lot of things.
I want to show you both.
I mean, he said, of course, that the goal was twofold. Demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification of Ukraine.
So a few days before the invasion, Putin gets on TV and addresses the nation.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие друзья.
It's this unsurprising hour-long history lecture where Putin lays out his grand argument as to why Ukraine, in fact, isn't a real country.
He's very much about history.
Instead, Ukraine was created by the authors of the Russian Communist Revolution 100 years ago.
Please watch my video too. Again, not to beg for watch my other content, but there's a lot of things I don't want to just talk about again. But in Johnny's first video, he mostly talked about the Ukraine-Russia situation and the history just from the perspective, or just basically starting with Soviet history. When I say and talked about how it's much more important to go back to Russian Empire history. You definitely want to know that if you want to know your context.
And now Ukraine, this invented country that's just an extension of Russia itself, has been hijacked by the US and Europe, who have installed
yes, there are many Russians in Ukraine, but
to run the show. Seriously, he said all of this.
Not enough to say that they are Russia.
If you want. According to his story, the West did this to eventually force Ukraine into their military alliance called NATO,
but they're not in it.
They will use to defeat Russia, just like
Ukraine's never been in it.
He says this, just like Hitler did 80 years ago. But this time, Putin will make sure that Russia is ready for the invasion.
Yeah, much of Ukraine, by the way, if you didn't know, supported the Germans in this in World War II. So there's a leftover of that. Of again, Ukrainians that were supporting the Germans to kick out the Russians. And so that's one reason why Russia today, like Putin, might see Ukraine more as an extension of, you know, because again, he uses that term Nazification, that there's still remnants of that.
Второй раз мы такой ошибки не допустим.
Oh gosh, there is a lot.
Preemptive warfare.
Here. The neo-Nazi thug thing, I will get to that in a second. But the message was clear. Putin was basically like, Ukraine, if you're going to disavow communist Russia and all of the things that it gave to you, you don't deserve the land that you got from communist Russia. And in fact, all of this land still belongs to Russia, and we're going to take it back.
Please, if you don't know, why Ukrainians would object to what he just said, Putin saying about you guys are ungrateful. The Holodomor, okay, massive famine constructed by the Soviet Union, at least that's how it's discussed, and Joseph Stalin, that led to one of the worst famines and deaths of starvation that we've seen in modern history. Right? Ukrainians might have a very different slant on that.
Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
But this warped historical framing of who rightfully owns this land isn't quite enough to justify an invasion, maybe in like 1860 or something, but not today. So Putin needs to really emphasize the villain.
Yeah, since the World Wars, the justification for invasions is much tighter than it was. Not to say they don't happen and for just and unjust reasons, but nevertheless, the world has rethought of that since kind of the end of imperialism, or at least of the 19th century imperialism.
In his story. So he makes a big part of his story this idea that Ukraine, this fake country, is being run by American-backed anti-Russian neo-Nazis who are holding the Ukrainian people hostage.
Неудивительно, что украинское общество столкнулось с ростом крайнего национализма, который
Those far-right groups exist, but they are quite small. Not in the one that they have massive amounts of political power.
форму агрессивной русофобии и неонацизма.
Okay. It's easy to poke fun at like the delusion of Vladimir Putin, but let's talk about the facts here and what Putin is actually basing this off of, because it really matters for understanding
Johnny's doing some context
and why he's going to lose. First, let's just clear up the fact that Ukraine wasn't invented by Russia. Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was a thriving city long before Moscow was even on the map. Ukraine has a very
older than Russia.
Culture. But what Putin has done is twisted modern history to make a claim that Ukraine actually isn't a legitimate country. And he does this because it's a very key part of his story, one that supports the second major argument, which is that Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis who want to exterminate the Russian-speaking population. So let's get the facts here. Within Ukraine, there is indeed a faction of far-right neo-Nazis who have a political party and a militia force. And this militia force has actually joined the Ukrainian army in the past 8 years to fight Russia back from annexing any more territory in the east of the country.
Yeah, and you saw these groups really pick up with the annexation of Crimea, and that was the group within Ukraine that rose up the most against it. And the whole Crimea situation, again, something I've covered a lot more, is different than the claims that Russia is making of the rest of Ukraine, as Crimea has a much deeper Russian history, more recent Russian history than the rest of Ukraine. But that's a little bit more of another story. But yes, those far-right, basically neo-Nazi groups, they absolutely exist and are pretty loud in their rhetoric.
You may have remembered that Russia took over a big part of Ukraine called Crimea 8 years ago.
Ukrainian forces have set up a perimeter, but it's clear that we are completely surrounded by Russian forces.
Yeah, these neo-Nazi fighters, sort of nationalist guys, came up
and war
as
journalists.
a resistance to that. And yeah, Putin.
By the way, you see their flags? Let's see if I can find one.
Sort of nationalist guys.
But people say these are just new kind of remnants of swastika and things like that, like reimaginations of it. I don't know enough of the history of the symbology there, but it is something I've heard of. If you know something more about it, let me know down in the comments.
Came up as a resistance to that. And yeah, Putin's got one thing right. These are not good people. These are literal neo-Nazi white supremacist soldiers that commit all sorts of atrocities and train children in their ideology and fighting tactics. So yeah, Putin, I get it. These are bad people, neo-Nazis. We don't like them. But Putin is claiming that these are the people running the country, running Ukraine.
That's the difference.
When in fact, if you look at the data from the 2019 election in Ukraine, you'll see that the country's ultra-nationalist far-right coalition gained barely over 2% of the vote and 0 seats in the parliament. They are a small group of extremely fringe far-right fighters that Putin has latched onto.
A good thing, a thing to think about is you probably have that kind of percentage of ultra nationalists of like 2%. You probably find that in any country, every country, right?
Oh, and there's a more obvious bit of data here, which is that the Ukrainian president is Jewish and has family who died in the Holocaust. Ukraine is not run by neo-Nazis.
Yeah, and that's if you just use... So I hear that all the time. It's like, how can they say they're neo-Nazis when their president is Jewish? But, you know, the ultra-nationalism is really what they want to take. Not as much of a recreation of German Nazis, you know what I mean? Like the German ultra-nationalists, which have their own brand and definitely have their own views towards Jews and things like that. But they just mostly mean, when you're talking about, like, we talk about these like neo-Nazis as ultra-nationalists. Yes, they could have a racial supremacy and stuff like that, but their outside groups may be seen as different right? Like you can be like this, you know, ultra nationalist, but not necessarily be anti-Semitic.
Listen, to balance my view on this, because I'm in the West and I'm getting all Western media, I have actually been watching Russian state TV to like see what the narrative is on their side.
Check it out. It's really interesting how they cover it.
Believe that the country is run by Nazis.
It is reminiscent of the practices and methods of Nazi Germany.
And we're seeing a full revival of Nazism and fascism in Ukraine.
You know, bringing up Nazis, if you might talk to Russians, and I've heard this before, people that have lived in Russia and stuff, that term is used a lot. Anytime you want to bring up and vilify an enemy, you talk about Nazis, that they're Nazis, and they use the history for sure, World War II and of Nazis, a lot, and can to justify positions. And again, there's a lot of understanding of that. I mean, 20 million Russians are going to die to Nazi Germany, so there is justification that, but that term is still thrown around and used very effectively to obtain political and militaristic goals ever since World War II.
I've tried to dig into this to try to understand, like, is there more like meat on the bone here? No, there's not. A fringe group of militiamen in the Far East are what Putin is basing this off of. Over here in reality land, Ukraine is a nation of 44 million people with its own culture that is thousands of years old. It is a country where fewer and fewer people like Russia. In fact, it's a country that ousted the pro-Russian leader in 2014.
That's another context people don't understand, is that, yeah, Ukraine did have a pro-Russian leadership and saw that, and that, again, 2014 is a huge year. It's the year Crimea was invaded by Russia and annexed. That there have been pro-Russian governments there, and obviously since the Ukrainian civilization, that you saw that chart there a second ago, right here, you can see how Ukrainian, this is this source, again, I always want to look at those sources, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, so a Ukrainian source here, you can see the attitudes towards Russia plummeted in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, which makes sense that they would, you know, put in political leaders that are not going to be pro-Russian, are going to be more anti-Russian, and you can see now what's happened with that, and it makes sense.
Russia. In fact, it's a country that ousted the pro-Russian leader in 2014.
Oh yeah,
don't
Russian
want
leader.
Russia and
or the
Putin
Ukrainian pro-Russian leader.
But all of these facts are explained away very conveniently by Putin's bigger conspiracy, which is that it's actually outside forces that are pulling the strings, and that the people of Ukraine have been brainwashed by the West. And yet there is one thing that Putin is absolutely right about.
Это наши товарищи, близкие, среди которых не только коллеги, друзья, бывшие сослуживцы, но и родственники. Люди, связанные с нами кровными, семейными.
There are a lot of ethnic ties.
These two countries are deeply connected through culture and language and history and exchange. A war against Ukrainians would not sit well with the Russian people. And this explains why Putin needs to frame the war in a very certain way. Not an invasion to take over a sovereign nation of Russia's brothers and sisters, but rather a rescue effort to save the Ukrainian people from these aggressive villains who are really controlling the country.
And that's why the Russians are calling this, what are they calling it, like a special protection mission, or whatever, peacekeeping and all that, rather than that, because framing it again as an invasion of Ukrainian people, that is not something the Russian population wants. But again, if you frame it in this other way, that again, the Ukrainian people are again being exploited, right, then that might gain a lot more support.
В курсе ли всех этих управленческих методов сами украинцы? Понимают ли, что их страна находится даже и под политическим и экономическим протекторатом, а сведена до уровня колонии с марионеточным режимом?
Okay, I'm about to jump into the maps and look at how the war is actually playing out and help us understand it. But I really, really want us to keep in mind Putin's story, because it really will make everything click. So let's just go over it really quickly. Putin's story is really four things. Number one, Ukraine really belongs to Russia. Number two, it has been hijacked by the US and Europe, i.e. the West. Number three, the West is controlling Ukraine with its neo-Nazi puppets. Also that the West military alliance, called NATO, can use Ukraine as a bridge to get to Russia, who they want to defeat. And all of this leads to Putin must invade to free Ukrainians and protect Russia from the West. That is it. That is the justification that Vladimir Putin has been building for years, if not decades.
So, I mean, if you look at this and you believe all of these things, and if Putin can tell the Russian people and anyone else that might be on board outside of Russia, then yeah, these are very important points and very, points that can be supported for some kind of military intervention if you truly believe all of these things. But again, it comes down to, are these things true? Right? And it seems pretty hyperbolic right now.
The justification that Vladimir Putin has been building for years, if not decades.
Повторю, наши действия — это самозащита от создаваемых нам угроз и от еще большей беды, чем та, что происходит сегодня.
Minutes after this second address last week, where he laid out all of his justifications, in the middle of the night, the rockets start flying and the tanks start rolling.
So as wars fought, missiles and heavy machinery, not so much boots on the ground.
And this is how it started. What is becoming the most consequential
gunfighting
war in Europe since World War II. A pretend rescue effort framed as an operation to denazify the country. Russia comes in from all sides, quickly taking over mostly rural areas, but slowly moving towards the major cities.
The country is being attacked from all directions. Some of those Russian troops are heading here to the capital.
In addition to tanks and troops taking over land, Russia also starts firing missiles that hit targets all throughout the country.
Who resist. Oh, I tell you what, I just heard a big bang right here.
The invasion, the attack that Russia promised would never happen, has now started.
People who live in Kyiv are sleeping in underground subway stations. It's the only place they feel safe.
Ukrainians fled to basements,
kind of like the Blitz,
to bomb shelters.
Some people are adjusting
in London in World War II.
Of living in a country now at war.
Hundreds of thousands fled to the borders west of the country, looking for safety.
Others are taking trains to the west to get out of the country.
They are fleeing into neighboring countries like Moldova, Romania, and Poland.
At the city's central train station, a frantic dash as people try to escape to the west of the country.
But wait, remember Putin's story? According to this story, after this initial invasion, Ukrainians were going to wake up from their slumber and welcome him with open arms.
Right, first place that he's wrong. Yeah, that they'll be welcomed as liberators and join them. Not happening in the slightest. Not in the slightest.
The neo-Nazi president was going to flee, and Ukraine would be returned to Russia, Putin becoming the savior of the Russian motherland. But that is exactly
I wonder if he truly believed that, though.
Happen.
Outgunned and outnumbered,
did he truly believe that happened?
Soldiers and
What
civilians
happened?
alike are mounting a stiff resistance.
I used to teach maths and physics, but 2 days ago, the Russian army took control of my town, so I signed up to fight.
Every day, Ukrainians are taking to the streets to fight for their homeland.
Was that guy pushing the tank from the front, like trying to stop it?
I used to teach maths and physics.
Yo, teachers! We can do stuff too! We're not just nerds, okay?
But 2 days ago, the Russian army took control of my town, so I signed up to fight.
This guy, does this guy think he's gonna stop the tank? He's just, no, I got you. You're not going nowhere.
Today, Ukrainians are taking to the streets to fight for their homeland.
That's tough, though.
Let those Russian shits come here, she says. We are ready to greet them.
We are ready to fight. And fight like hell.
This is my city. This is my land. I have to protect it.
You do not feel they're going to succeed in taking out your administration and your government?
No way. As they will never take Kyiv.
The response of Ukrainians, both military and civilian, is where Putin's story starts to crumble.
The entire world is witnessing the determined and brave resistance by the Ukrainian army and population.
I have never seen Ukraine that united.
And as for the president of Ukraine, the alleged neo-Nazi drug addict thug puppet of the West, well, the U.S. actually offered to airlift him out of the country for his own safety.
The show his quote.
Instead of taking the offer, his response was, quote, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride."
I've seen that. That's memeified. Everyone's, memeing the war right now. But yeah, I've seen that. People wanted to make shirts that said, "I need ammunition, not a ride." Zelensky.
Which, by the way, that quote has been turned into a t-shirt that you can buy on Amazon.
Ukrainians are fighting for...
Hold on, let me look at that shirt.
Turned into a t-shirt that you can buy.
The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. That's a pretty good looking shirt, just as a shirt itself. Dude, I bet that sold a lot, whoever made this.
On Amazon.
Ukrainians are fighting for love of country. Russians are fighting out of a fear of a dictator.
In the event of Russia opting for escalation, Ukraine will defend itself.
Man, watch the UN Security Council meetings and UN meetings have been wild. They have been so entertaining. If you've never seen a UN meeting, and there's a good reason why, because a lot of them might seem boring or something. But man, these ones are so fascinating, especially with Russia. Russia's a permanent member of the Security Council, which is the big kids table of the UN. They're also the president of it. And it's just bashing each other. It's really fascinating to look at.
He then sent a video around to the country of him in central Kiev, making it known that he is staying, he is fighting. So despite being totally outmatched militarily, Ukrainians are fighting back, showing that the outcome of a war is as much determined by the courage and patriotism of the population as it is by the number of missiles and troops that you have.
To an extent, though. I mean, courage takes you so far, and that's where we still need to see where this is going to take us. There's still a long ways to go, and a lot I think that unfortunately the Ukrainians have not witnessed yet with full Russian capacity, and we'll see how that goes. But let's just be real.
Наступать войска, если у нас попытаются отнять нашу страну, нашу свободу, наши жизни, жизни наших детей, мы будем защищаться. Не наступать, защищаться. Наступая, вы будете видеть наши лица, не наши спины, наши лица.
I've been talking to people inside Ukraine and seeing this devotion firsthand. How is morale right now among you and among the people you're talking to?
Honestly, extremely high.
Ukrainians aren't letting this conquest happen, and in doing so, they are turning Putin's argument, his story, on its head, and foiling what appears to be his initial strategy for wrangling Ukraine back into his sphere of influence.
Now, I'm hoping, and I don't know if Johnny's going to get to it, which is these stories of the resistance and all that and the failures are not getting back to the Russian people. The country is censoring itself, and censoring outside media. Okay, it's already has state-run media, but all other sources, social media and stuff is getting shut down. And Russia, because again, their structure, the way they are with how they are able to control media, is able to filter everything. So if you're waiting for the general Russian population to stand up because they're learning, maybe true facts of how this invasion is going, that's not going to happen because those are not getting to the Russian people's ears and eyes.
One Ukrainian I talked to said that there's a waiting list for the Ukrainian army.
Our regional defense won't accept any more people because it's bad.
The queues are growing.
And you cannot even get in right now.
Men volunteering to fight.
Molotov cocktails for those who want to fight.
You're
don't have a gun.
Making Molotovs.
A tweet from the Ukrainian Defense Ministry to prepare Molotov cocktails to throw at the.
Oh, he got it on himself.
I'm here in order to protect my family, my country.
There is an incredible sense of unity here. The morale is very high.
Okay, this sounds all positive, and it is, but this is still war, and Putin can still conquer a lot of land. He can take over major cities, install a puppet government, and be the new ruler of Ukraine. He has the military to do it, and he seems to have the tolerance for bloodshed.
Especially if other countries are going to come in the ground. I mean, it's one thing to put in materials and all that stuff, but there's still something about having troop presence of some kind, and that's going to be the big difference, because again, based on what the Ukrainians have as far as people and stuff goes, Russia still dwarfs them.
He seems to believe in his fantasy story so much that he's gonna keep up this crusade. But I'm here to tell you that Putin has already lost this war.
I'm still not fully convinced yet from his points.
I mean, let's play this out so I can
need to see more.
Let's say Putin keeps going. He keeps sending troops in and missiles despite all of this resistance. He could eventually take over the major population centers, including the capital Kiev. All of this with the same goal that he's had the whole time, which is getting the Ukrainians to give up and realize that Russia is actually the country they want to align with. He's also kind of hoping that maybe the Ukrainian military will come to their senses and take over the government and negotiate with Putin. But let's say they never do. They probably won't. Instead, they keep doing what they've been doing for the last week, resisting, defending, condemning, and broadcasting all of it to the world on the internet. So Putin has no choice but to drive the government out and install a pro-Russian regime. In order to do this, he's going to need a massive military presence to keep control of these cities and their people. It's now costing him tens of billions of dollars and crippling his economy, which, by the way, is only like the size of Texas. I mean, one of the biggest knocks on Putin's plan is the sheer size of Ukraine. Let's zoom out and realize that Ukraine is huge. It's the biggest country in Europe, if you don't count Russia, the giant country that extends into Asia. Occupying this entire landmass would be basically impossible for Russia. So you have a map that maybe looks something like this.
I guess I didn't think of it enough that way.
Space for Ukrainians to gather and mount their resistance.
But the Ukrainians could lose a lot of their area. If a deal ends up coming with that, if they have to sign over again everything you're seeing in the dark red, it'd be hard to see that with Kiev unless they have to, and Kiev gets taken over and just the new Ukrainian capital becomes Lviv, and they just have this western part. I mean, that's a possibility. Depends on what a deal ends up looking like.
Giving Russia hell for an indefinite period of time. Meanwhile, back home in Russia, they've now seen the imagery from the ground. They now see that Putin's story justifying this invasion is total BS. There's no Nazis, there's no brainwashing of the people. Instead, in this scenario, Russians are thinking of deaths of our Ukrainian brothers and sisters.
I hope he though just isn't going to say though that like all the Russians are not behind this. It's still, I thought I had heard that still most Russians believe the narrative and support the actions there under what they understand it to be. You'll notice a lot of these people that are against it are younger, right? It's the younger sector of the population who are going to be very loud and boisterous, but there's still a lot of support from the Russian people there. Plus the idea that you've probably heard about thousands of protesters being arrested. That happening as well,
while also destroying the Russian economy.
Almost every
that is
Russian
true.
has
The sanctions are
from
incredible.
Ukraine, either a friend or a relative or a colleague. This is a war between brother nations.
Protesters in the streets demonstrating against Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
On top of all of that, the rich Russian business guys who keep Putin in power, the oligarchs, they aren't happy because the entire world has cut Russia off. Russian billionaires.
That is a very interesting thing that we're looking at, which is I still see this talk about who's pulling the strings in Russia. Is it the oligarchs pulling Putin's strings, or is Putin pulling their strings? Can these oligarchs, who again basically run the country, a handful of ultra wealthy people, will they somehow use their resources, which again have been largely seized, and Putin has the ability to seize theirs as well? Can they do something to take him out of power or something like that? That I don't know enough about yet. Is again the connection. I know there's this big connection with the oligarchs and Putin, but who inevitably can get their way if they want it? The oligarchs collectively, or Putin himself, especially in this time period.
Moving their yachts, scrambling their jets, and shifting their assets to prepare for a possible crackdown.
They can't access their financial reserves. Their ability to move money is made much more difficult. People aren't letting their trade vessels into ports.
New efforts by U.S. law enforcement to make Russian oligarchs
Those yachts are
feel
just
the
insane.
pain of Putin's war.
I mean, this is effectively what sanctions do. So the oligarchs are now like, dude, Putin, WTF, and they put pressure on him to stop this madness. But even still, Putin has enough power that he could still dig in his heels and keep trying to get Ukrainians to come under his rule. But by this point, Ukrainians are done with Putin. They see his true colors. Anyone who was on the fence before has now witnessed civilians being killed in Putin's war of choice. They won't come on his side now. The upshot here is that there's not really a scenario where Putin keeps going and gets what he wants. And that's because the story that he based this invasion off of is proving to be totally wrong. All of these assumptions that he predicated his war on turned out to be the delusions of a pseudo-history buff stuck in the logic of the Cold War, not the realities on the ground today. At another
There's
point
delusion involved.
against Putin camp, meanwhile, Putin's war has united the West and NATO like never before.
True.
NATO has a new sense of purpose, a new thing to rally around.
That's going to backfire. Now, nations that have stayed out of NATO because they want to maintain a balance and don't want to upset Russia, or again, even just entering the EU in general. But yeah, this is because as what I'm talking here, there's been discussions. I don't know if they will come to fruition of some of the countries that aren't part of NATO, someone like Finland, Sweden, and getting them to join, or Georgia, getting them to join up, could have an opposite effect of what Putin is talking about and hoping for.
Something they've been looking for since the end of the Cold War. And Ukraine, who is currently getting tons of support and weapons and money and aid and refugee
there's a
support
lot of
from
that,
NATO
almost
countries,
unlimited.
is now way more likely to sympathize with the West, because now they've seen the realities of what Putin has to offer, which is falsehoods and unprovoked conflict, all in the name of some ill-defined vision of former imperial glory. Nope.
It's my city, it's my hometown, it's my homeland, it's my country, and I'm not the one who should live. The Russians are the one who should live.
Russia is a great nation, full of beautiful culture, geography, history, and people. The vast majority of those people don't want imperial-style
that old lady, she's about to get
war. They want to live their
clapped.
lives, to prosper, to connect. And yet, the warped, delusional worldview of one greedy man has cut off their ability to do that. How is that possible?
The Russian people have no say in the behavior of their government under the Putin dictatorship.
I'd like to just give you a heads up of some feedback I want for another video to cover. I do really like the Johnny Harris stuff. He also just put out a video about China and Taiwan, and if China could use what's going on here as a justification to do something they wanted to do for a long time, which is to fully reclaim Taiwan. If that's something you'd like me to cover, let me, and you're still with me in the video here, again, thanks for being here. Let me know down in the comments too if that's something you'd like to see me cover quick.
Incredibly brave people, often young people in Russia, who are out on the streets protesting against what their president is doing.
This is not the war by the people of Russia. This is yet another military adventure by the unaccountable, unelected, increasingly deranged dictator in the Kremlin by the name of Vladimir Putin.
This situation is developing and certainly will take paths that no one can predict. By the time you're watching this, I'm sure some key development has happened that I haven't covered here. But I feel pretty certain
Not quite.
Say that Putin really doesn't have a path to the victory that he set out to achieve last week when he sent people and weapons across his border to attack his neighbors. Ukrainians, with their bold courage, have proved him wrong. I know that sounds very poetic and maybe even cliche, but in this case, it's true.
So if someone told me a week ago I would own an assault rifle, I would not believe.
So now the world will stand by and support as they continue to wage this battle for the future of their land that belongs to them, not to a Russian dictator.
Just for everyone to know, it's our land, it's our home, we will defend it.
13 Ukrainian border guards defiantly telling an invading Russian warship to go F yourself when asked to surrender.
And we'll
That thing is one of the most memified stories. The whole Russian, the guys that held that fort on that little island of telling the Russian warship to go, blank themselves. Last time I heard about those guys is at first they thought they died and then they think they were captured. And then I thought there was another development. We'll have to see what's happening with that. But that's been a kind of interesting story to follow within all the other stories here.
Win. Russian ship, go fuck yourself. Slava Ukraine.
Okay. All right, I'll give you my final thoughts. So again, the video was titled, why Putin will lose. And for whatever that means, what losing and winning means, I still don't feel like I've seen enough of what Russia may be capable in this situation to see that necessarily Putin will lose. Now, again, it depends on what we're talking about winning and losing. It's already a loss if it was totally dictated by this idea that the Ukrainians were going to rise up, support the overthrowing of Zelensky and the government at Kiev, and then embrace Russia. Like, okay, yeah, that's absolutely a loss. But it still seems like there is a possibility, depending on what agreements actually happen between the sides, that Russia could take more territory, replace the government. I mean, I don't know yet. It's still, I feel like, too early. Again, I'm recording this. It's Sunday, March 13th. So I'm not fully convinced yet if, again, we're saying Putin will lose. What that means is that the Russians will be completely kicked out with no consolations and no conditions of any kind. I'm not sure that's going to happen. It still seems like it's very likely and very possible that there can be some kind of conditional end to this where Ukraine might have to sacrifice something of theirs. What that is, I don't know. Because again, so much of this has been so unpredictable that I think it's very difficult to make predictions right now. That's just my honest take on it right now. So I'm watching this every day. I know a lot of you are. If you've watched throughout this video, you've been watching my coverage of it, and you're watching this far into the video again, which has been a long time. I can tell you're invested in it too. And again, it is a fascinating thing. And for a lot of younger people like myself who didn't, experience, say, the Vietnam War or World War II, of course, like that kind of stuff, this is a fascinating thing to see globally, especially when you talk about, like, as Americans have been involved in conflicts. I'm an American, but seeing other large scale things by other countries like this, because people keep saying it's the biggest thing in Europe since World War II and all that, and that's very Eurocentric to think about, of course, but nevertheless, it's been interesting to experience this and see history unfold and change one day at a time, because that's how history is. History is made right now. It's always being made. And hopefully one thing, again, you've been getting out of these videos I've been covering is historical context. And I don't feel like I gave a ton in this video, because that's really wasn't this was about. This is more about predictions in a lot of ways. Check out the other videos I've covered with Russia, Ukraine to get all the context you'll ever need. But nevertheless, I think it's been good to be able to talk about. But again, I'm still a little bit unconvinced, a little bit. Again, it totally depends, though, on what we mean by Putin will lose. So we'll just see. I'll keep covering. Again, if you want me to keep covering it, let me know again down in the comments. Ask a bunch of questions during the video. Let me know in the comments down there. Be sure to be respectful to other people, because that's the only way we make progress in these discussions. All right, again, the original video is down below. Be sure you support Johnny Harris. He does some great investigative work, and it gets some discussions going, and it's useful to be able to do that. So again, if you stuck this long, hopefully you liked the video. Give it a thumbs up. Subscribe, because I do a lot more response videos. That's what I do a lot of here, and I hope to do more coverage of this as well if that's something you're interested in. Thanks again to today's video sponsor, Drink Trade. Again, if you go to drinktrade.com/Mr. Terry, you're going to be able to get $20 off your order of your first 3 bags. And with that, we'll see you next time. Bye.